The day 10,000 warriors vanished without a trace. Imagine this. You are standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert. The sun is beating down on you so hard that the air itself feels like it's on fire. There is no shade, no water, no road, and no sound except the wind dragging sand across the dunes. And somewhere out here, swallowed by this endless, merciless wasteland, 10,000 of the most feared soldiers on the planet walked in and never walked out. No bodies, no weapons, no bones, no graves, nothing. Just 10,000 men who vanished as completely as if the earth itself had opened up and taken them. This is not a legend. This is not a myth someone made up around a campfire. This is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the entire history of human civilization, and it has been haunting archaeologists, historians, and explorers for over 2,500 years. And the crazy part, we still do not have a definitive answer. We still do not know exactly what happened to them. So today, we are going to go all the way back to 524 BC, into the court of one of the most powerful and most terrifying rulers the ancient world had ever seen, and we are going to follow his army step by step, grain of sand by grain of sand, all the way to the moment they cease to exist. Stay with me, because this story is about to get wild. So let me set the stage for you, because the context here is everything. We are talking about the Persian Empire. And when I say empire, I do not mean a country with some influence over its neighbors. I mean the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. I mean a civilization so vast, so powerful, so unrelentingly dominant, that when they showed up at your borders, most kingdoms just surrendered on the spot, because the alternative was too horrific to contemplate. At its peak, the Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Greece all the way to Pakistan, from the mountains of Central Asia all the way down to the scorching deserts of Egypt and beyond. They controlled millions of people. They had resources that stagger the imagination, and their armies were legendary. Now the man sitting on top of all of this in 524 BC was a king named Cambyses II, and Cambyses was not your gentle, diplomatic, let-us-negotiate kind of ruler. He was his father's son. His father was Cyrus the Great, the founder of the entire Persian Empire, a man so respected that even the Bible speaks of him with admiration. But Cambyses, he was cut from a different cloth. He was aggressive, unpredictable, and by many ancient accounts, genuinely terrifying. Some historians debate whether he was clinically unstable or whether the stories about his cruelty were exaggerated by his enemies, but either way, his reputation was one that made grown men go pale. And Cambyses had just done something extraordinary. He had invaded Egypt. He had marched into one of the oldest, most sophisticated, most symbolically important civilizations on Earth. And he had crushed them. The Battle of Pelusium, in 525 BC, was a decisive Persian victory, and suddenly Cambyses was not just the king of Persia, he was pharaoh of Egypt. He sat on the throne of the pharaohs. He wore the double crown. He controlled the Nile. This was an unbelievable achievement, and it should have been enough. For any reasonable ruler, it absolutely would have been enough. But Cambyses was not finished, because sitting in the western desert of Egypt, deep in an oasis called Siwa, was an oracle, the oracle of Ammon. And this oracle had become a serious problem for Cambyses, not because it was saying anything threatening, but because of what it represented, and more specifically, because of what it had said about him. The oracle of Ammon was one of the most respected voices of divine authority in the ancient world. People traveled thousands of miles to consult it. Kings sought its blessing. And crucially, it had not legitimized Cambyses as a proper pharaoh. In a world where divine authority was not just symbolic, but was the literal foundation of political power, this was not something you could just brush off. If the gods did not recognize you, your subjects had every spiritual justification to resist you. So Cambyses made a decision. He was going to send an army to Siwa. He was going to take that oracle by force, silence it permanently, make sure it never again said anything that undermined his rule. And while he was at it, he was going to conquer the oasis of Siwa and demonstrate to every remaining pocket of Egyptian resistance that there was nowhere beyond his reach. No desert was too vast. No distance was too great, no oasis was too remote to escape the long arm of Persia. He assembled an army, and we are talking about a serious force. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who is our primary source for this story, tells us it was 50,000 men. Now, some modern historians think that number might be exaggerated, as ancient writers often inflated troop counts for dramatic effect, and the practical logistics of moving 50,000 men across a desert make the number almost nightmarish to contemplate. But whether it was 50,000 or whether it was 10,000, the point is the same. This was a massive, well-equipped, professional military force. These were not conscripts grabbed off the street. These were trained Persian soldiers, some of the best fighting men in the known world. They had supplies, they had water, they had guides. They knew what they were doing. And they walked into the desert, and they were never seen again. Now let me walk you through the route, because understanding the geography is what makes this story so haunting. Cambyses had established his base of operations in the ancient city of Memphis, deep in the Egyptian heartland. The army set out from Thebes, which is in Upper Egypt. Their destination was the Siwa Oasis, which sits about 560 kilometers west of the Nile, buried deep inside what we now call the Western Desert. If you look at a map, this region is part of the Greater Sahara, and it is one of the most hostile environments on the face of the earth. The Western Desert of Egypt is not like the rolling sand dunes you might picture from a movie. Large parts of it are flat, featureless, pale rock and gravel stretching in every direction, with nothing to anchor your sense of direction, nothing to tell you where you are, no landmarks, no shade, and at certain times of year, no mercy whatsoever from the sun. The army would have been following the known route towards Siwa. Ancient trade routes did exist across this desert, maintained by traders and nomads who knew the water sources and the safe paths. But these routes were narrow lifelines. Step off the path, and the desert swallows you. The army apparently made it to an oasis town called Karga, which would have been roughly the halfway point. They took on supplies there, the locals watched them pass, and then they continued west towards Siwa. And according to Herodotus, that is where it ends. He writes that after leaving the oasis of Karga, the army marched for 7 days until they reached a place the locals called the Island of the Blessed. They made camp there. They ate their meal. And then, sometime during the night or the following morning, a sandstorm of catastrophic proportions swept down on them. Not just any sandstorm, a sandstorm so violent, so absolute, so total, that it buried the army completely. All of them. 10,000 men buried alive under the sand before they could even react, and the desert sealed over them as if they had never existed. That is the story as Herodotus told it. And for centuries, people simply accepted it. Of course, it seemed plausible. The Sahara does produce violent storms. The desert can be lethal. And it explained the absence of survivors in the most dramatic way possible. But then, as the science of archaeology developed and historians started asking harder questions, people began to wonder, was Herodotus right? Did he have good sources for this? How do we know? And most critically, if 50,000 men were buried out there somewhere, where is the evidence? Where are the bones? Where are the weapons? Where are the artifacts that should have been waiting for someone to dig up? And the answer, for a very long time, was absolutely nothing. There was no evidence, and that was deeply strange, because in archaeology, armies leave traces, even natural disasters leave traces, mass graves leave traces. The earth remembers, but the desert had kept this secret with an almost supernatural stubbornness. Now here is where it gets really interesting, and here is where I want you to understand something about how historical mysteries actually work. For a long time, the academic consensus was cautiously skeptical. Many scholars believed the story might be embellished, that perhaps a smaller force, simply gotten lost and died of thirst, and that Herodotus had dramatized it into something bigger. Others thought maybe the army had never actually reached the deep desert at all, and had simply turned back. A few radical voices suggested the whole story was a fabrication, Persian propaganda designed to explain an embarrassing military failure without admitting the soldiers had mutinied or deserted. But in 1977, something happened that changed the conversation. An Egyptian archaeologist named Ali Barakat was working in the area west of the Siwa Oasis when he made a startling discovery. He found human remains in the desert, bones, and not just a few bones, but the bones of multiple individuals, along with what appeared to be ancient weaponry and artifacts. He reported the find, but it was never fully excavated or systematically studied, and over time it faded back into the footnotes of the debate. But it planted a seed. Something was out there. Then came the year 2009, and two Italian archaeologists changed everything. Twin brothers, actually, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, who had spent years working in the Egyptian desert, announced that they had found what they believed to be the remains of Cambyses' lost army. They had been following a logical geographical analysis of the route the army would have taken, cross-referencing ancient texts with satellite imagery and ground survey, and they had zeroed in on a specific area in the desert. And, when they got there and started looking, they found bones. Hundreds and hundreds of human bones, scattered across a wide area. They found ancient Persian-style arrowheads. They found bronze implements. They found fragments of horse equipment. They found human skulls, and they found something that made their spines go cold. Evidence that the bones had been partially covered and then uncovered again repeatedly over centuries, which is exactly what you would expect to see in a desert area hit by powerful recurring windstorms. The Castiglione brothers announced their findings with confidence. They held up the arrowheads. They showed the bones. They pointed to the location on the map and said, "Here it is. Here is the lost army of Cambyses. We found it." But the scientific community was not so fast. Other archaeologists looked at the findings and raised serious questions. How do you know these bones are Persian? How do you know they are from 524 BC? Ancient deserts accumulate bones from many different periods and many different causes. Caravans died. Travelers perished. Battles were fought across North Africa at many different points in history. Without proper radiometric dating, without DNA analysis, without stratigraphic context from a formal controlled excavation, you cannot confidently say these particular bones belong to the particular army of Cambyses II. The scientific bar for a claim this significant is high, and by that bar, the Castiglione discovery, while genuinely exciting, remains contested. The Egyptian government itself complicated things further by being extremely restrictive about further excavation in the area. For years, permits were delayed or denied, and the scientific community was left in the frustrating position of knowing something interesting was out there, but not being able to go get it properly. So let us step back and think about this from a different angle for a moment, because I want to ask you a question that historians and scientists have been wrestling with, and it is actually a deeper question than it first appears. Is it physically possible for a sandstorm to kill 10,000 people at once? The answer is complicated, and it is genuinely fascinating. Modern meteorologists who have studied the extreme storm systems of the Sahara describe events that are almost beyond comprehension in scale. They are called haboobs, and at their most extreme, these are walls of sand that can be a kilometer high and stretch across hundreds of kilometers of desert. They move fast, sometimes faster than a person can run, and when they hit with full force, the visibility drops to absolute zero in seconds. You literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. The sand is not just in the air, it is the air. And critically, these storms can last for hours. The sustained wind pressure can be enough to knock a person down. The sand can physically suffocate people who cannot protect their airways. Animals die. Entire camels have been found buried by major storms. There are documented cases in modern times of vehicles being buried, of buildings being partially submerged, of landscapes being completely transformed overnight. So could a storm bury 10,000 men? The physics says yes, at least theoretically. If the army was moving through a natural basin or low-lying area, if they were caught in the open with no shelter, if the storm was severe enough, it is not physically impossible that a catastrophic loss of life could occur. But the key word there is catastrophic loss. Because here is the thing that keeps nagging at historians. Even if 9,900 soldiers died, what about the ones who were at the edge of the column? What about the scouts? What about the soldiers who were furthest back? What about anyone who survived even partially? And what about the officers, who in any ancient army were typically on horseback and would have had a better chance of surviving than men on foot? The survival of zero people is the part that strains credibility. Because zero is a very specific number, it implies a totality of destruction that goes beyond even the most severe natural disaster. When floods kill villages, some people always swim away. When earthquakes collapse cities, some people always survive in the rubble. When deserts kill armies, as they have done throughout history, there are always stragglers who crawl back. Some wounded, some delirious from thirst and exposure, but they come back. Someone always makes it out to tell the story. And yet from Cambyses' army, the story itself says no one returned. That is either a miracle of destruction, or it means something else happened that we have not fully accounted for. And that something else is where the real historical detective work begins. Because there are actually several competing theories about what happened, and none of them has been definitively ruled out. The first is the one Herodotus gives us. The sandstorm. We have already talked about this, and the physics are plausible, but the totality of the destruction remains a stumbling block. However, there is a version of this theory that is more scientifically sophisticated than Herodotus's dramatic account. Some researchers have pointed out that under certain conditions in flat desert terrain, a severe storm can create localized areas of extreme air turbulence combined with sand loading that can be survivable in one part of a wide column, but essentially fatal in another. If the army was spread over a large area, different sections could have experienced dramatically different conditions. But even this does not fully explain the absence of survivors crawling back to tell the tale. The second theory is one that historians talk about less publicly, but find quite compelling. Mutiny and desertion. Think about this from the perspective of the soldiers. You are a Persian warrior, yes, but you are also a human being. You have been marching through a hostile country far from home for months. You have just conquered Egypt, which was supposed to be the main event. And now your king, who by all accounts is becoming increasingly erratic and frightening, is sending you into the deep Sahara to go silence an oracle in a remote oasis. This does not feel like a campaign of glory. This feels like a death march. Morale would have been poor. Water would have been getting scarce. The guides may have been uncertain. And in those conditions, soldiers who mutiny do not march back to the king and report what they have done. They scatter. They disappear. They go somewhere the long arm of the Persian Empire cannot reach them. Some might have joined desert tribes. Some might have gone west toward Libya or south toward sub-Saharan Africa. And a story that says 10,000 men vanished is a perfect cover for what was actually an organized disintegration of a force that simply did not want to die in the desert for a king they no longer trusted. The third theory is connected to politics back home. When Cambyses eventually returned to Persia from Egypt, he found his empire in turmoil. His brother Smerdis had either been assassinated by Cambyses himself before he left on campaign, or someone was impersonating Smerdis and had seized the throne. Cambyses died under murky circumstances before he could retake power. And into that power vacuum stepped a man named Darius, who would go on to become one of Persia's greatest rulers. Now, Darius had every reason to shape the official historical narrative of the Cambyses period to make Cambyses look incompetent and unstable. That is just politics. It is how power transitions are legitimized. If the story of the lost army was shaped or amplified by Persian propagandists working for the new regime, it would explain why the account is so absolute, so theatrical, and so conveniently final. The fourth theory, and this one has gotten more traction in recent years, is that the army did reach the vicinity of Siwa, but was repulsed or destroyed in combat. The Siwa Oasis was not undefended. The local population, the Ammonians, were not going to simply open their doors to an army sent to destroy their most sacred site, and the desert tribes that surrounded Siwa had been living in that environment for generations. They knew every water source, every sand trap, every seasonal route. A Persian army that was already weakened by the journey, perhaps suffering from heat exhaustion and dwindling supplies, facing local forces that could melt in and out of the desert landscape at will, using guerrilla tactics in terrain they understood better than any outsider ever could, might have been cut to pieces systematically, not in one dramatic moment, but over days or weeks. 1,000 here, 3,000 there, pinned down at a dry well, ambushed in a narrow pass between dunes, picked off by desert fighters who knew exactly where to hit them. And if that happened, the survivors might have been absorbed into the local population, or taken as slaves, or simply continued west and built new lives somewhere beyond the reach of historical record. Now I want to take a moment and talk about something that I think does not get enough attention in most discussions of this mystery, and that is the cultural and spiritual dimension of what the Oracle of Amun actually meant in the ancient world. Because without understanding that, you cannot really understand why Cambyses would risk an army on this particular mission. The Oracle of Amun at Siwa was not just locally famous, it was internationally famous. It was the ancient equivalent of a major center of religious authority. Pharaohs consulted it. The founder of Carthage reportedly consulted it. Most famously of all, centuries later, Alexander the Great himself would travel to Siwa in 331 BC to be confirmed as the son of Amun, the son of a god, and use that divine legitimacy to cement his claim to rule over Egypt. The oracle's endorsement was worth armies. It was worth gold. Because in the ancient world, divine legitimacy was not separate from political power. It was the foundation of political power. The gods did not just bless rulers, the gods justified rulers. And a ruler whom the gods rejected was a ruler whose subjects had divine permission to overthrow. When Cambyses conquered Egypt, he tried to walk the line between being a conqueror and being a legitimate pharaoh. The ancient sources tell us he performed some Egyptian religious rites, but also that he was accused of desecrating sacred sites, killing the sacred Apis bull, and generally showing contempt for Egyptian religion. Whether all of that is true, or whether some of it is Egyptian propaganda designed to delegitimize the Persian occupation, is something historians still debate. But what is clear is that the Oracle of Amun remained a thorn in his side. As long as it existed, as long as it spoke with authority that he had not earned, it was a rival power. Not military power, not economic power, but something deeper and harder to kill. The power to name who was righteous and who was not. Sending 50,000 soldiers against an oracle is, when you think about it, one of the most expensive acts of insecurity in human history. It tells you something profound about how seriously divine authority was taken in the ancient world. You do not send your army to silence something you consider irrelevant. You send it when you are afraid of what it might say next. Let us jump forward now to the modern era of investigation, because some of the most fascinating developments in this story have come from satellite archaeology, which is a field that has genuinely transformed how we look for things buried in deserts. Using high-resolution satellite imagery, researchers can now look at the subsurface structure of desert terrain in ways that would have been impossible even 30 years ago. Certain wavelengths of light penetrate the sand and reveal anomalies below the surface. Buried structures show up as geometric shadows. Large concentrations of metal, like ancient weapons, can sometimes be detected by specific reflectance patterns. Several teams have applied these tools to the area between Sahara Oasis and Siwa over the past 2 decades. And what they have found is genuinely intriguing. There are subsurface anomalies in certain areas that do not match the natural geology of the region. There are patterns that suggest either buried structures or large accumulations of foreign material. None of this is definitive, and none of it has yet been matched by ground truthing at the specific locations of interest. But it is enough to keep serious scientists interested. It is enough to keep the mystery alive, not as folklore, but as an active scientific question. In 2014, a team from the University of Naples published a paper arguing that based on the most careful analysis of the ancient texts and the geography, the most likely site of the army's disappearance was a specific area of the Gilf Kebir Plateau, a vast elevated sandstone formation in the southwestern corner of Egypt, near the border with Libya and Sudan. This region is extraordinarily remote even today. It was the setting for some of the scenes in the film The English Patient. It is a place where ancient petroglyphs of swimmers carved into the rock walls suggest that thousands of years ago it was a very different landscape. Once a place of lakes and rivers that dried into a bone-dry plateau. The researchers argued that if the army had been misled by their guides, whether accidentally or deliberately, they could have wandered into this region and perished there in conditions from which escape would have been essentially impossible. The distances involved, the absence of water, the total lack of shelter from wind and sun would have made survival without external help essentially a death sentence. But even the Naples team was careful to say this was hypothesis, not conclusion. The evidence is suggestive, not definitive, and that is the honest state of the science. After 2,500 years, the desert is still keeping its secret. Now I want to think with you about something that I find personally the most thought-provoking aspect of this whole mystery. It is the question of what it means for something to vanish. We live in a world today where vanishing is almost impossible. There are satellites overhead. There are phones in every pocket. There are border crossings with cameras and databases and international coordination. If 10,000 soldiers disappeared today, we would find them within days. The tools we have for tracking human movement, for detecting masses of metal and organic matter, for satellite surveillance of even the most remote terrain, make the idea of a modern army vanishing absurd on its face. But in 524 BC, vanishing was easy. The ancient world was enormous and almost entirely empty by our standards. The Sahara Desert alone is larger than the continental United States, and in 524 BC there was no systematic documentation of who was in it at any given time. Number census, number satellite, number radio. If 10,000 men walked into that desert and chose not to come back, or were swallowed by a catastrophic storm, or were killed in a series of desert ambushes, or simply scattered to the four winds after a devastating defeat, the world would not know it in the way we would know it today. Word might filter back, rumors would spread, Herodotus would write down what he heard generations later. But the hard documentation, the confirmed account, the kind of record we would demand before accepting a story as factual, that simply did not exist. And that absence of documentation is itself a kind of historical ghost. It haunts every reconstruction of ancient events. We are building our understanding of this story on fragments, on a few lines from Herodotus, written a century after the events, on archaeological finds that may or may not be related, on logical inference from geography and military history. We are, in a sense, also navigating by the desert stars, trying to find our way to a truth that the sand has spent 2,500 years trying to bury. There is one more dimension of this story that I think deserves serious attention, and that is what happened to Cambyses himself in the aftermath. Because here is where the mystery gets its full tragic shape. After the army disappeared, Cambyses continued to rule Egypt, but things began to deteriorate rapidly. The ancient sources describe him as becoming increasingly erratic and violent. He reportedly executed members of his own court on suspicion of disloyalty. He made decisions that alienated his Persian nobility. His campaigns against other African nations, including an attempted invasion of Ethiopia, were failures. He began to look less like a conqueror in his prime and more like a man unraveling under the pressure of an empire that was starting to slip through his fingers. Then came the news that shook everything. Back in Persia, someone had seized the throne, claiming to be Cambyses's brother Smerdis, whom Cambyses had secretly killed before leaving for Egypt. Whether this claimant was actually Smerdis, somehow having survived, or whether he was an impostor using Smerdis's name and identity as a cover, is one of the other great mysteries of the Persian period. But the effect on Cambyses was immediate and devastating. He had to go home. He had to deal with this challenge to his throne, or lose everything he and his father had built. He set out from Egypt, marching back toward Persia, and somewhere during that journey, in Syria, he died. The manner of his death is disputed. He died of a wound that he suffered in an accidental fall from his horse, according to some accounts. Others suggested suicide. Others whispered of assassination. He was not yet 40 years old. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was thrown into civil war after his death, and the story of his lost army was just one of many strange chapters in a reign that had ended as chaotically as it had been conducted. And here is the haunting thought that I keep coming back to. Cambyses never got his answer. He never found out what happened to his army. The soldiers he sent into the desert, all those men, all those lives, disappeared while he was still sitting on the throne of Egypt, with his own downfall still approaching. He sent 10,000 men into the desert to silence a god, and instead, the desert silenced them. Whether it was nature, whether it was treachery, whether it was poor logistics or local resistance, or some combination of all of these things, those men went into the sand and stayed there. And their king, who ordered that campaign, died before he could find out why. History has a way of doing that, of leaving the questions open, of keeping the sand over the bones just a little while longer. So where does this leave us today? What do we actually know, and what are we still searching for? We know that an army was sent by Cambyses II of Persia toward the Siwa Oasis in approximately 524 BC. We know from Herodotus that this army was large, estimates ranging from 50,000 to perhaps 10,000 depending on how credible you find the ancient sources. We know that the army never arrived at its destination. We know that no survivors were officially recorded. We know that Herodotus attributed the disappearance to a catastrophic sandstorm. We know that archaeological finds in the western desert of Egypt have produced ancient bones and weapons that some researchers believe are connected to this army. And we know that none of this has been fully confirmed by modern scientific standards. What we do not know is precisely where the remains are. We do not know the exact cause of the army's destruction. We do not know whether it was one event or a series of events. We do not know whether there were survivors who were never recorded in the historical accounts that made it back to us. And we do not know whether the Castiglione discovery represents the actual site of the army or just another layer of the desert's vast and indifferent collection of human remains. What is happening right now, as of the time this video was made, is that several research teams are still actively pursuing this question. New satellite imagery analysis is being conducted. Permit negotiations with Egyptian authorities for proper systematic excavation are ongoing. DNA analysis technology has now advanced to a point where if well-preserved bone material is found in the right quantities and with the right context, it would be possible to determine through ancient DNA analysis whether the individuals were indeed of Iranian origin, which would be the crucial confirmation that these were Persian soldiers. The science is finally catching up with the mystery. It is just a matter of time, and political access, and funding, and a little bit of luck. Let me leave you with something that I think is the real lesson of this story. Because at its core, this is not just a mystery about bones in a desert. It is a story about what happens when the most powerful force in the world collides with something it cannot control and cannot understand. Cambyses had an empire. He had 50,000 soldiers. He had the best military organization of his era. He had conquered Egypt, one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. And none of that was enough. The desert does not care how many soldiers you have. The desert does not care about your titles or your bloodline or the size of your treasury. The desert is indifferent in the most absolute way possible. It does not negotiate. It does not make exceptions. It simply does what it does, and what it does is survive long after everything that was ever placed inside it has turned to dust. There is something deeply humbling about that, something that puts every human ambition in perspective. Here was a man at the absolute top of the ancient world, with resources and power that most people of his era could not even imagine. And he lost 10,000 soldiers, his best soldiers, to a piece of geography. Just sand and sun and wind, the most basic, most ancient, most indifferent forces on earth. And maybe that is why this story has stayed with us for 2,500 years. Not just because of the mystery of where the bodies are, but because of what the mystery whispers to us about the limits of human power. because of what it says about the hubris of kings and the patience of deserts. Because of what it reminds us, every single time we hear it, that the earth holds its secrets for as long as it wants to, and it will give them up only on its own terms, in its own time. Somewhere under the Saharan sand, 10,000 warriors are waiting for someone to find them. Why? Waiting for the science to catch up with the centuries, waiting to finally tell us what happened on that day, in that desert, when they walked into the silence and became part of it forever. We will find them. Maybe not today, maybe not this decade, but we will find them. And when we do, I promise you, we will be here to tell you the whole story. If this video got you thinking, if it made you feel that pull of the unknown, that is the best thing history can do to a human mind, then hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more curious people just like you. Subscribe if you have not already, because we do this every week. We go deep, we go back in time, and we bring back the stories that the history books skim over, but that deserve the full treatment. And leave me a comment below. Tell me what you think happened to Cambyses' army. Was it the sandstorm? Was it mutiny? Was it something else entirely? I read every single comment, and I want to know where your head is at. I will see you in the next one.